Captain Thomas Heartwell had served the royal family for 23 years. His uniform was always perfect, his posture straight as an arrow, and his dedication unwavering. At 52 years old, he had become one of the most trusted guards in Buckingham Palace. Thomas had protected kings and queens, princes and princesses through countless public events, state visits, and private moments. But lately, something was weighing heavily on his heart. His daughter Emma, who was only 8 years old, had been asking the same question every night for months. "Daddy, when will you come to my school play?" Thomas would ruffle her blonde curls and promise he would try, but deep down, he knew his duties at the palace would always come first. Emma's mother had passed away 3 years ago, leaving Thomas to raise his daughter alone. His sister Margaret helped during the day, but Thomas felt the gap in Emma's life growing wider each passing month. She needed her father, not just a man who came home exhausted every evening with stories of royal protocols and security briefings. The palace corridors that once filled him with pride now felt like golden chains. Thomas had given his best years to the crown, missing birthdays, school events, and bedtime stories. He watched other guards come and go, some choosing family over duty while he remained steadfast in his position. But watching Emma's disappointed face each time he missed another important moment was breaking his resolve. Prince George, now 11 years old, had grown up seeing Thomas almost daily. The young prince was known for his quiet nature and thoughtful observations. Unlike his more outgoing siblings, George often spent time reading in the palace gardens or drawing in his notebook. Thomas had always admired the boy's gentle spirit and intelligence, but their interactions were always formal and brief, as protocol demanded. Thomas stood at his usual post outside the family's private dining room, his mind wandering to Emma's upcoming birthday. She had asked for just one thing, for Daddy to be there when she blew out her candles. The request seemed so simple yet felt impossible given his responsibilities. He had already requested the day off twice, only to have it denied due to important state functions. The weight of his decision was crushing him. Thomas loved serving the royal family, but he loved his daughter more. He had been thinking about resignation for weeks, drafting and redrafting his letter to the head of security. The thought of disappointing his colleagues and breaking decades of loyal service made his stomach turn. But the thought of disappointing Emma one more time felt even worse. As he stood guard that evening, Thomas noticed Prince George walking slowly down the hallway, carrying his usual notebook. The boy seemed lost in thought, occasionally stopping to look out the tall windows at the palace gardens. There was something different about his demeanor tonight, though Thomas couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Thomas straightened his shoulders and maintained his professional stance, but his heart felt heavier than ever. Tomorrow, he would have to make the most difficult decision of his career. He would have to choose between the job he had dedicated his life to and the daughter who needed him most. Little did he know that Prince George had been observing more than anyone realized, and that the young prince was about to change everything. The next morning brought unexpected changes to the palace routine. Prince George had spent most of the night thinking about something he had overheard near the staff quarters. While walking to the library, he had heard Thomas talking quietly to another guard about his daughter's birthday and his impossible choice between duty and family. George had always been a keen observer of the people around him. He noticed things others missed: the sadness in Thomas's eyes during long shifts, the way the guard's shoulders sagged slightly when he thought no one was looking, and how Thomas always carried a small photo in his breast pocket. Once George had caught a glimpse of it when Thomas was adjusting his uniform. It was a picture of a little girl with bright eyes and a missing front tooth. The young prince understood loneliness in his own way. Despite being surrounded by family and staff, he often felt isolated by the weight of his future responsibilities and the formal distance that protocol required. He had grown to appreciate Thomas's steady presence over the years, noticing the guard's kindness during difficult moments and his gentle way of handling situations. That morning, during breakfast with his family, George was unusually quiet. His grandmother, the Queen, noticed his thoughtful mood and asked if everything was all right. George simply nodded, but his mind was racing with an idea that seemed both simple and revolutionary. He had been taught that with privilege came responsibility, and he was beginning to understand what that truly meant. After breakfast, George did something he had never done before. Instead of heading to his tutoring session, he walked purposefully toward the head of security's office. Thomas was stationed nearby, and the prince could see the resignation letter folded in the guard's hand. The man looked as if he was preparing to knock on the office door, his face a mixture of determination and deep sadness. Prince George approached Thomas with quiet confidence. The guard immediately straightened and prepared to offer the formal greeting, but George held up his hand gently. For a moment the two stood in the hallway, the young prince looking directly into the eyes of the man who had silently protected his family for over 2 decades. "Captain Heartwell," George said softly, using Thomas's formal title with unusual gravity for someone his age. "May I speak with you privately?" Thomas was surprised by the request but nodded respectfully. George led him to a small alcove near the palace library, away from the usual flow of staff and visitors. The prince seemed to be gathering his thoughts, his notebook clutched tightly in his hands. "I know about your daughter," George said quietly, causing Thomas to stiffen slightly. "I know about her birthday, and I know you're thinking about leaving." Thomas felt his heart racing. He had always been careful to keep his personal struggles private, never wanting to burden the royal family with his problems. The fact that Prince George had not only noticed but cared enough to speak about it was overwhelming. George opened his notebook and showed Thomas a drawing he had made the night before. It was a simple sketch of a man in a guard's uniform holding hands with a little girl, both of them smiling. Beneath the drawing, in George's careful handwriting, were the words, "Some things matter more than rules." The prince looked up at Thomas with eyes that seemed far older than his 11 years. "You've taken care of my family for my entire life," he said. "Now I want to take care of yours." Thomas stared at the drawing, his throat tight with emotion. In all his years of service, no member of the royal family had ever acknowledged his personal life, let alone shown such genuine concern for his struggles. The simple sketch captured something he had been feeling for months but couldn't put into words. The pull between duty and love. "Between service and sacrifice, Your Highness," Thomas began, his voice carefully controlled. "I appreciate your kindness, but there are protocols, procedures that must be followed. I cannot simply—" Prince George closed his notebook and looked directly at the guard. "Captain Heartwell, do you know why I spend so much time walking through the palace halls?" When Thomas shook his head, the prince continued, "Because I'm learning. I'm watching how everyone contributes to keeping our family safe and happy, and I've learned that loyalty isn't just about following rules. It's about caring for the people who care for you." The young prince's words carried a wisdom that surprised Thomas. George had grown up in the palace, watching the intricate dance of duty and hierarchy that governed every interaction. But somehow, he had developed an understanding that went beyond protocol. "I've been thinking about this all night," George continued. "My great-grandmother always told me that true leadership means recognizing the humanity in everyone around you. She said that the crown's strength comes not from the power it holds, but from the love and loyalty it inspires and protects." Thomas felt his carefully constructed professional barriers beginning to crumble. The resignation letter in his hand suddenly felt heavier, representing not just his own difficult choice, but the failure of a system that could force such an impossible decision. George reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, official-looking envelope. "I wrote a letter to the Queen last night," he said, holding it out to Thomas. "Would you like to know what it says?" Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. "I told her about you, about your daughter, and about what real loyalty looks like. I explained that keeping families together makes everyone stronger, not weaker. And I made a request." The prince paused, watching Thomas's face carefully. "I asked if we could create a new position, a special advisor for family welfare among our staff. Someone who would ensure that the people who serve us so faithfully don't have to choose between their duty to the crown and their duty to their own families." Thomas felt his heart stop. The implications of what Prince George was suggesting were enormous. It would require changes to decades-old protocols, adjustments to staffing schedules, and a fundamental shift in how the palace viewed the personal lives of its employees. "Your Highness, such a change would require approvals from multiple departments, reviews of security protocols, budget considerations," Thomas began, but George held up his hand again. "I know it's complicated," the prince said with a small smile, "but complicated doesn't mean impossible. My grandmother taught me that the right thing to do is rarely the easy thing to do, but that's what makes it the right thing. George looked down at his notebook again, then back at Thomas. Captain Hartwell, you've spent 23 years putting my family's needs before your own. Don't you think it's time we returned the favor? The hallway fell silent except for the distant sounds of the palace coming to life around them. Thomas stood frozen, the resignation letter trembling slightly in his hand, while an 11-year-old prince waited patiently for his response to a gesture of kindness that could change everything. The following days brought a whirlwind of quiet activity throughout the palace. Prince George's letter had indeed reached the Queen, and while Thomas continued his regular duties, he noticed subtle changes in the atmosphere around him. Senior staff members who rarely acknowledged him were nodding respectfully as they passed, and there seemed to be hushed conversations happening behind closed doors. Thomas had decided not to submit his resignation letter, at least not yet. Prince George's unexpected intervention had given him something he hadn't had in months: hope. But he tried not to let that hope grow too large, knowing how slowly the wheels of royal bureaucracy typically turned. Meanwhile, Prince George had not been idle. The young prince had done something remarkable for someone his age. He had begun quietly researching the personal situations of other long-serving palace staff. He discovered that Thomas was not alone in his struggle. Several other guards, housekeeping staff, and even some administrative personnel had similar challenges balancing their dedication to the crown with their responsibilities to their families. George had filled several pages of his notebook with names, situations, and potential solutions. He approached the task with the same methodical care he brought to his studies, treating it as the most important project of his young life. His tutor had noticed his increased focus and engagement, though she had no idea what was driving this newfound sense of purpose. On Thursday afternoon, Thomas was summoned to the Queen's private study. His hands were steady as he walked through the familiar corridors, but his heart was racing. He had been in the Queen's presence countless times during official functions and security briefings, but never for what seemed to be a personal audience. The Queen's study was warm and inviting, filled with family photographs, personal mementos, and the gentle afternoon light streaming through tall windows. She was seated at her desk when Thomas entered, her expression kind but unreadable. "Captain Hartwell," she said, gesturing for him to sit in the chair across from her desk. "I understand my great-grandson has been sharing some interesting observations with me about the welfare of our staff." Thomas sat carefully, maintaining his professional posture despite the informal setting. "Your Majesty, I hope Prince George's concern hasn't caused any inconvenience. My personal situation is not something that should burden the royal family." The Queen smiled softly, an expression that reminded Thomas of the grandmother she was, not just the sovereign she represented. "Thomas, may I call you Thomas? I've been reviewing your service record. 23 years of flawless duty, exemplary conduct, and unwavering loyalty. Not once have you requested special consideration or complained about the demands of your position." She picked up a folder from her desk and opened it. "I've also been learning about your daughter Emma. 8 years old, lost her mother 3 years ago. An excellent student who loves to draw and wants to be a veterinarian when she grows up." Thomas felt his composure wavering. The fact that the Queen had taken the time to learn about Emma's dreams and interests was overwhelming. "Your Majesty, I'm honored that you would take such interest, but I don't expect any special treatment. If my personal obligations are interfering with my duties, they're not interfering, Thomas." "That's precisely the point." The Queen leaned forward slightly. "My great-grandson has shown me something I should have seen long ago. The strength of this institution doesn't come from the blind sacrifice of good people like yourself. It comes from recognizing that the people who serve us best are those who have love and purpose in their own lives." She closed the folder and looked directly at Thomas. "Prince George has proposed what I believe to be a revolutionary, but necessary change to how we operate. And after much consideration and consultation with senior staff, I've decided to implement it." Thomas held his breath, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. "Effective immediately. We're creating a new family support initiative for all palace employees. Flexible scheduling for important family events, assistance with childcare during extended duties, and a special liaison position to ensure that our staff's personal needs are considered in all scheduling decisions." The Queen paused, watching Thomas's face carefully. And I'd like you to consider accepting the role of family welfare coordinator, in addition to your security duties. Who better to understand the challenges our people face than someone who has lived them? Thomas sat in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of what the Queen had just offered. The position she described would not only solve his own dilemma, but could help countless other palace employees who had quietly struggled with similar challenges for years. Your Majesty, he finally managed, his voice thick with emotion. I am deeply honored by your confidence in me. But I must ask, how did Prince George know about Emma's dreams of becoming a veterinarian? I've never mentioned that to anyone here. The Queen's eyes twinkled with something between pride and amusement. That, Thomas, is where the story becomes even more remarkable. It seems my great-grandson has been conducting his own research into the lives of our staff members. Not through any official channels, mind you, but through the simple act of paying attention and asking gentle questions when opportunities arose. She opened another folder and showed Thomas several pages covered in Prince George's careful handwriting. He's documented the personal challenges facing dozens of our employees, single parents struggling with childcare, aging staff members caring for elderly relatives, young people trying to continue their education while working. George has proposed specific solutions for each situation. Thomas scanned the pages, amazed by the depth of thought and compassion that had gone into each entry. Prince George had somehow managed to learn about Emma's veterinary dreams during a brief conversation with the palace's dog handler, who had mentioned that Emma always asked detailed questions about animal care whenever she visited the palace. The boy has shown remarkable maturity in understanding that an institution is only as strong as the people who serve it willingly and happily, the Queen continued. But there's something else, Thomas. Something that has impressed me even more than his problem-solving abilities. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the palace gardens where Prince George could be seen sitting under a tree with his notebook. When I asked him why this matter was so important to him, do you know what he said? Thomas shook his head, still overwhelmed by everything that was unfolding. He said that watching you struggle with an impossible choice had taught him more about leadership than any of his formal lessons. He realized that true authority comes not from making people choose between their loyalties, but from ensuring those loyalties can coexist and strengthen each other. The Queen turned back to Thomas with a gentle smile. He also said that if the crown couldn't protect the families of those who protected the crown, then it didn't deserve their service. Thomas felt tears threatening to fall, something that hadn't happened during all his years of stoic service. The wisdom and compassion of an 11-year-old boy had not only saved his career but had inspired institutional change that would benefit generations of palace employees. There's one more thing. Thomas, the Queen said, returning to her desk and picking up a small, elegantly wrapped package. Prince George asked me to give you this with a message. Thomas accepted the package with trembling hands and carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a small silver frame containing the drawing Prince George had shown him in the hallway, the guard holding hands with his daughter. Below the original inscription, new words had been added in gold lettering. Captain Thomas Hartwell, Family Welfare Coordinator, Buckingham Palace. The message, the Queen said softly, is that your first official duty in your new position is to attend your daughter's birthday party. Prince George has personally ensured that your schedule is completely clear for the entire day. Thomas looked up at the Queen, no longer able to contain his emotions. Your Majesty, I don't know how to thank you or Prince George for this extraordinary kindness. The Queen smiled warmly. The best thanks you can give, Thomas, is to use this opportunity to help other good people avoid the impossible choice you almost had to make. And perhaps someday you can teach my great-grandson a thing or two about being a father, when his time comes. 6 months later, the changes at Buckingham Palace had become legendary among royal staff members worldwide. Thomas's new role as family welfare coordinator had not only transformed the lives of dozens of employees, but had created a model that other royal households across Europe were beginning to adopt. Emma's 8th birthday party had been everything a little girl could dream of. Thomas had been there for every moment, from helping her blow out the candles to reading bedtime stories afterward. But more importantly, he no longer had to choose between being a devoted father and a dedicated guard. His new position allowed him to excel at both. The palace had become a different kind of workplace. Staff members no longer lived in fear of having to choose between their professional duties and their family obligations. Flexible scheduling, emergency family leave, and childcare assistance had created an atmosphere of loyalty that was stronger than any rigid protocol ever could have achieved. Prince George had continued his quiet observations and thoughtful interventions. His notebook had grown thicker with ideas for improving life at the palace, and his formal education now included regular discussions about leadership, empathy, and the responsibilities that came with privilege. His tutors marveled at his maturity and his genuine interest in the welfare of others. Thomas had discovered that his new role brought him more satisfaction than he had ever imagined. Helping a young housekeeping assistant arrange her schedule so she could attend night school, ensuring that a veteran guard could take time to care for his ailing mother, coordinating childcare for staff members working during state functions. These tasks gave his service new meaning and purpose. The most remarkable change, however, was in the relationship between Prince George and the palace staff. The young prince's intervention on Thomas's behalf had become something of a legend, spoken of in hushed tones of respect and admiration. Staff members no longer saw him as merely a future king to be served, but as someone who genuinely cared about their well-being. One afternoon, as Thomas was reviewing applications for the palace's new scholarship program for staff children, Prince George appeared at his office door. The boy, now 12 and showing signs of the thoughtful leader he would one day become, carried his familiar notebook and wore a slight smile. "Captain Hartwell," he said, still using the formal title despite their changed relationship, "I wanted to thank you for something." Thomas looked up from his desk, surprised. "Thank me? Your Highness, I should be thanking you every day for the rest of my life." Prince George shook his head and sat in the chair across from Thomas's desk. "You've taught me the most important lesson about leadership I could ever learn. You showed me that true strength comes from admitting when something isn't working and having the courage to change it." The prince opened his notebook to a page near the back, filled with sketches and notes about future projects and improvements.
"I've been thinking about other ways we can make the palace a place where people can thrive, not just survive.
And I've realized that the best leaders are those who make other people better at what they do." Thomas smiled, seeing in the young prince the makings of a truly exceptional future king. "What did you have in mind?" "Emma told me she wants to start a veterinary club at her school," Prince George said. "I was thinking the palace could sponsor it, maybe even arrange for her class to visit our veterinarian here. And perhaps we could start similar programs for other staff children, art classes, science clubs, whatever interests them most." Thomas felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came whenever he was reminded of how much his life had changed thanks to one boy's quiet courage. "That's a wonderful idea, Your Highness. Emma would be thrilled." Prince George closed his notebook and stood to leave. At the doorway, he paused and turned back to Thomas. "Captain Hartwell, there's one more thing. I hope that someday when I'm king, I'll have the wisdom to surround myself with people like you. People who understand that serving others means caring about their whole lives, not just the part that involves the crown." Thomas stood and offered a respectful bow, but Prince George extended his hand instead, offering a handshake between equals. "Thank you, Prince George, for teaching an old soldier that sometimes the most powerful act is the quietest one." As the young prince walked away down the corridor, Thomas returned to his desk and picked up the silver-framed drawing that had started it all. In the reflection of the glass, he could see his office filled with thank-you notes from grateful staff members, family photos, and Emma's latest school artwork proudly displayed on the wall. The royal guard who had almost stepped down had instead stepped up, and in doing so, had helped transform not just his own life, but the lives of everyone around him. All because a young prince had understood that true leadership means lifting others up, not demanding they sacrifice everything to serve.